Hi there, I'm Epstein, and in this talk, I'm going to explore how we can use layperson judgments to combat misinformation on social media by downranking distrusted sources, and hopefully shed some light on the question, will the crowd game the algorithm? This is joint work with Pennycook and Dave Rand. The rise of misinformation on social media has not only posed a serious issue for democracy in the information age, but also has raised interesting social and technical questions about how platforms should fight misinformation. Here's a taste of 3 possible approaches to this question. The first line of defense is automated detection with algorithmic and machine learning approaches. But this has some problems. For one, there's no clear definition of what content and features should be including in training sets. And relatedly, is the fact that misinformation is non-stationary and tends to evolve very rapidly. Finally, there are thorny ethical questions about how to treat false positives and when it's okay to censor content that an algorithm tags as bad. A second approach is to have professional fact-checkers evaluate content to determine its veracity. But this approach isn't scalable because often the fact-checkers can't keep up with how fast bad actors can create false content, and the evaluation process itself can be pretty slow. So the problematic content never winds up getting identified, and even the content the moderators do flag was probably flagged way after the period of peak virality. In addition, the use of professional fact-checkers may actually promote the acceptance of misinformation via the implied truth effect, whereby people interpret the absence of a warning as evidence that the story may have been fact-checked and validated. And finally, the moderators themselves may become traumatized or start to believe the conspiracies that they see all day. A third approach involves the development of tools for helping users detect misinformation for themselves. These can help individuals in the sometimes daunting task of increasing discernment online. A major limitation of these tools, however, is that they require people to opt into using them, which is a killer blow because people who are most susceptible to misinformation may be less likely to choose to use such tools in the first place. A promising alternative to these approaches that has received considerable attention is to use crowdsourcing to identify misinformation as inputs to a ranking algorithm. Here's how it works. First, the platform could elicit user trust judgments about content. This could then be fed directly as input to a newsfeed algorithm. The newsfeed would then downrank mistrusted content, thus preventing its spread. We focus on a system in which users judge the trustworthiness of domains that produce misinformation, rather than individual pieces of content. This crowdsourcing approach is promising, but the question remains, will the crowd game the algorithm to advance their own partisan agendas? There is some evidence that layperson trust may be distorted by politically motivated reasoning. But a growing body of evidence suggests that reasoning may not be held captive by ideology when evaluating the accuracy of news. Survey studies find that people who engage in reasoning are less likely to believe false political headlines, regardless of ideological alignment. But even if their judgments are not impaired by partisan bias, there is some evidence that lay people may be simply unequipped to identify misinformation due to a lack of media literacy. This suggests that layperson ratings may be noisy and ineffective. In counterpoint to this concern, however, is the large literature on the wisdom of the crowds, which shows that aggregating responses can dramatically reduce noise. And perhaps most relevant here, even if lay people do produce effective ratings, they may choose not to in an effort to game or astroturf the crowdsourcing system towards partisan ends. But ultimately, it's an open empirical question if they would do so. These arguments and counter-arguments underscore the fact that although this crowdsourcing approach is fundamentally algorithmic, the challenges that must be overcome in order to implement it successfully are social in nature rather than technical, and thus involve empirical questions about how people would interact with such a system. In the present work, we first demonstrate that layperson trust ratings do indeed effectively identify misinformation outlets by replicating a recent study. Second, we investigate if participants change their responses when they are told the results will be used to inform social media ranking algorithms. We recruited participants for a survey using Lucid, a survey platform which uses quota sampling to provide a sample that is nationally representative on age, gender, ethnicity, and geographic region. 984 participants completed the survey and were indeed evenly distributed across age, gender, ethnicity, and political leaning. Each participant was shown a list of website domains and was asked, do you recognize the following website? And how much do you trust each of these domains? The domains were randomly sampled from a set of 89 news websites across the right-left political spectrum that fall into three categories. First is mainstream media outlets, such as CNN or Fox News. Next is hyperpartisan sites that produce misleading coverage of events that did actually occur, such as Breitbart and Daily Kos. And finally, we have fake news sites that generate mostly blatant false content, such as World News Daily Report and Daily Headlines. Each participant was shown 10 mainstream sources, 10 hyperpartisan sources, and 10 fake news sources. This allows us to compare their trust ratings of mainstream sources to their trust ratings of hyperpartisan and fake news sources in order to construct a measure of how discerning their ratings are, and thus their ability to effectively identify misinformation sites. To provide a firmer ground truth, we compare our participants' trust scores with trust ratings collected from 8 professional fact checkers for a subset of the 60 of the domains. We included a between-subject design in which participants were randomly assigned to either a control condition or a knowledge treatment, where they were told that their responses would be used to inform the ranking algorithms. Specifically, they were told, the overall results of the study, but not any individual's response, will be used to determine which news sources are relatively trustworthy and will be shared with Facebook with the goal of improving their platform. In particular, the goal is for content from sites which receive high trust ratings to be shown to more Facebook users than content from sites which receive low trust ratings. This experimental design allows us to causally assess the impact of this knowledge on discernment. Now for some results. On the x-axis, I have the trust among the Democrat participants, and on the y-axis, I have the trust among the Republican participants. Websites above the dotted line are websites that Republicans trust more than Democrats, and websites below the dotted line are websites that Democrats trust more than Republicans. I also have 2 plots, one for the control group and the other for the group that was told that their responses would influence the ranking algorithm. These plots tell a couple stories. First, we see that both Democrats and Republicans are pretty good at discerning mainstream domains from fake or hyperpartisan ones. We also see that there isn't so much a difference between the control and treatment groups. Taken together, these results suggest that people trust mainstream sources more than hyperpartisan or fake news sources, even when informed that their responses would influence the ranking algorithm. This visual impression is confirmed by entering trust ratings into a regression with the following independent variables: condition, source type, and the interaction between the two. We see a significant positive effect of source type, such that mainstream sources received higher trust ratings than non-mainstream sources, and no significant main effect of condition, nor a significant interaction between source type and condition. This implies that knowing that the ratings will inform ranking algorithms had no significant impact on average trust ratings. Next, we look at the differential effect of partisanship on the treatment by conducting the same analysis, but also including a dummy for participant partisanship and all interaction terms. We find no significant three-way interactions between partisanship, source type, and condition. This suggests that knowing that the ratings will impact the newsfeed does not affect how discerning people's trust ratings are for supporters of either party. Consistent with prior work, we do see a significant two-way interaction between partisanship and source type, such that Republicans trust mainstream sources less than Democrats. This is not to say, however, that the knowledge treatment had no effect. Although the treatment did not affect the crowd's ability to effectively discern between mainstream and misinformation sources, we did see an increase in political polarization. We define polarization as the absolute difference in trust ratings between Democrats and Republicans, which is visually represented as the degree of dispersion away from the diagonal dotted line. Here is the distribution of overall polarization in the control versus treatment. This suggests that our treatment made people respond in a more partisan fashion. But because people's polarization was small and pretty symmetric across party lines, they seem to cancel out when computing overall discernment. Therefore, the crowd ratings still effectively identify misinformation sources. Finally, we compare these results to ground truth by calculating the correlation between the politically balanced layperson ratings and the fact-checker ratings. These are very high in both conditions, 0.87 for control and 0.88 for treatment, and not significantly different from each other as determined by a Fisher R to Z transformation. Thus, the judgments of the lay people in the treatment are just as highly aligned as those of the professional fact-checkers as the lay people in the control. For completeness, we repeat the same comparison with the fact-checkers considering Democrats and Republicans separately. In both cases, we find no difference across condition, although we do find the correlation with the fact-checkers is significantly lower for Republicans compared to Democrats. To wrap up, we are super excited about crowdsourcing trust and downranking untrusted outlets as an approach to fighting misinformation. We found that layperson trust ratings are effective in discerning between high and low quality news outlets. Rather than being blinded by partisanship, our participants trusted mainstream sources much more than hyperpartisan or fake news sources. We also found that informing people that their responses will influence ranking algorithms did not affect discernment. This knowledge did increase the polarization of the responses, but cancels out in the end. We also found that Republicans were less discerning than Democrats. But interestingly, this was not because Republicans trusted misinformation more, but rather because they trusted mainstream sources less. This adds another piece of evidence to debates about ideological asymmetries in media judgment. Building better media environments requires a bunch of future work. It's important to note that our framework uses a website-level trust score, which does not take into account the variation in article quality that each website publishes. Relatedly, our method only considers 89 websites and the American media ecosystem. Understanding how these results generalize to different media cultures is crucial before such a system could be applied on global social media platforms. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's clear a crowdsourcing approach must consider whose opinion is being asked. How do we decide who decides? Answering this question requires not only transparency into content moderation, but also radical innovation in how platforms are governed. Thanks for listening.